All right. Welcome, everybody. Hello. Happy Tuesday to you. This is Sarah Hackney from the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. And we're just about to get started with the first of a 4-part webinar series in a partnership with the Southern Sustainable Agriculture Working Group and the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. And just a couple of admin notes at the top before we jump in. This webinar is being recorded. Technical challenges and all, we are going to record it. So if for any reason folks need to hop off early or you want to share the recording with a colleague after the fact, you're more than welcome to do so, and we'll do our best to get that recording information sent out just as soon as we can. It does take us a little time to process it, but we'll get it out for you just as soon as we're able. So, and with that, I think that's the only admin note. Oh, one more thing. Everybody on this call, with the exception of presenters, is in listen-only mode because we have a pretty large number of you on the phone. This way, if anybody's, that way it keeps down any sound conflicts for the presentation. However, we really welcome and encourage questions. So the best way to do so is to type them in the participant feedback box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. If we can answer your question kind of on the fly in the moment, we will. We also have some dedicated question time at the end. So we'll do our best to answer what we can in the flow of the conversation. We'll answer more questions at the end during Q&A. And if for any reason we don't get to your question, we also are making sure to record those questions so we can follow up with you directly after the call. And I see somebody ask about the regular beep. I apologize for that distracting beep. That's actually just the sound of folks still joining our webinar. So I'm afraid we'll still have some regular beeps for the next few minutes as folks sign on. So apologies for that beep. That is just the sound of more people hopping on the phone today. Thank you again for jumping on. And if anyone can't hear me, just give a holler in the notes. I think we've got our audio turned up. So hopefully that will address some of the volume concerns folks had earlier. And with all of that admin and housekeeping, I think we'll get started. And so just as a reminder, you're here. This is part 1 of what's going to be a 4-part series between NSAC and Southern SAWG. I'll walk you through really quickly with a reminder of the overview of the series. What we're going to cover today, and then we'll do just a few minutes of introductions around Southern SAWG and NSAC, and then we will dive right in. So again, today is part 1, Farm Bill 101 and the big picture. In 2 weeks, we'll have part 2, which is going to be a bit more of a deep dive, a program drill down, some details on specific programs and policies at a greater detail. So if you're interested in beginning farmer issues or local food issues, that's a great webinar to come and get even more details. Part 3 will be advocacy for busy people, how to impact the Farm Bill for the better, whether you've got 5 minutes or you can do it full time. And then part 4 will be we want to hear from you and have a conversation with you about how to move this work forward together. And these calls are going to be at regular 2-week intervals from now through the end of September. And again, today you're in part 1. Hope you're in the right place. What we're going to cover today. We're going to get into a little bit about why the Farm Bill matters, how it connects back to the real world, an overview of what's in it, the basics of how it gets written, key players in D.C., what we see as some opportunities and risks for the 2018 Farm Bill, and some key timelines to keep in mind. This one's aimed to be a fit for both beginners and those who may already be familiar with the bill. Hopefully there should be something for everyone, no matter whether this is your first time or you're a veteran. And this one's kind of mostly an explainer. We'll do our best to define terms, to not use jargon, and to really help you feel like you're getting grounded in what will be a big debate. I see a note to speak up a bit. Thank you, Natalie, for that. Let me know. I just turned my volume up, my headset volume up. Let me know if that's better for you. And with that, I would love to hand it over to the wonderful Steve Muntz, who's the Executive Director of Southern SAWG, to say hello and introduce a little bit about Southern SAWG.
Thanks, Sarah. Can you hear me all right?
Absolutely.
Great. Well, I'm glad everybody's joining us today, and as Sarah said, my name is Steve Muntz, and I'm the Executive Director of Southern SAWG. And I just want to give you a brief introduction about SAWG before we jump in here. The Southern Sustainable Ag Working Group began in 1991 when 25 folks from 17 different Southern organizations came together at the Highlander Center in Newmarket, Tennessee. Their purpose was to give Southerners a greater voice in how Southern agricultural and rural problems were solved, and to give farmers a leadership role in making Southern agriculture more sustainable. So since those early days, we've worked with and partnered with hundreds of organizations and thousands of farmers and individuals across the 13 Southern state regions, including NSAC. We can go to the next one there. The Southern SAWG's mission is to empower and inspire farmers, individuals, and communities in the South to create an agricultural system that's environmentally sound, economically viable, socially just, and humane. And because sustainable solutions depend on the involvement of the entire community, Southern SAWG is committed to including all persons in the South without bias. 3 primary program areas: successful, sustainable family farms, community food systems, and then bringing the Southern voice to the nationwide farm policy dialogue. Of course, that last program area is why we're working with NSAC on this Farm Bill webinar series. You can go to the next one if you want to. And Southern SAWG does hope to do some follow-up from this webinar series at our 27th annual conference in Chattanooga next January. So we hope you'll consider joining with over 1,200 farmers and farmer advocates at this one-of-a-kind conference. You'll find outstanding practical information and amazing networking that I'm confident will assist you on your farm or in your work. So that conference program will be online in early October at SSAWG.org, and like I say, we will follow up some with what we did on these webinars. So hope to see you in Chattanooga in January. Thank you, Sarah.
Absolutely. Thank you, Steve. I can definitely personally vouch for the awesomeness of the Southern SAWG Conference. I love getting to go to that one. I'd also love to extend an opportunity if Gabrielle Lane, I know she's on the call as well and does a lot of work with Southern SAWG and policy. If you'd like to say hello or anything else, you're welcome to hop in now.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm Gabrielle Lane with Southern SAWG, and I am over the Policy Collaborative Action Network, which is the group that worked with Sarah and Steve to put this Farm Bill series on. So thank you all for joining today.
Awesome. Thank you. And yeah, Gabrielle and some other awesome folks at Southern SAWG had the idea to put these together. So thank you all for jumping right in. We're super happy to be part of this. And I want to apologize. I heard someone noted that they're still hearing those annoying beeps, and I apologize for that. That's actually the sound of folks joining the webinar, so it should taper off now that we're getting started. Unfortunately, we don't have a way to turn that sound off. It's just the sound of people joining the webinar. So ideally, that'll taper off here now that we're a few minutes in. Apologies for that beep. Great. Well, let's say a little bit about who NSAC is and why we're here today, and then we're going to jump right in. So hi, I'm Sarah. I'm the Grassroots Director at NSAC. I'm based in Washington, D.C. in our offices here. Who are we? We are a grassroots alliance of over 100 member organizations and hundreds more partners and allies from around the country working together on federal food and farm policy issues. We've been at it for 30 years. And what we exist to do and to be is a voice in D.C. for grassroots folks working to improve policy. There's a lot of really important ways to improve our food and farm system. Policy is one of them, and policy is our specialty. We give voice and we help bring representation in D.C. for grassroots organizations. Southern SAWG is a member, as are many, many other organizations all across the South. Our membership is primarily nonprofit organizations. It's an important thing to understand. So we encourage individuals or farmers to join a member group in their state or in a nearby area. You can also always sign up for our email list regardless. But just to give you a sense, this is the sort of geographic spread of our membership. And I don't want to spend too much time talking about us, but I'll also mention, because sometimes folks like to see what's the farmer connection, what's the community connection to our work. And here's a little bit of how that happens. It all starts with farmers and with stakeholders. We here in DC do not choose what's most important or what's the work that we need to do. It comes from the base. Farmers and folks, community leaders, nonprofit folks, they share their experiences, their ideas, the challenges they're having that have a related piece to federal policy. They share it with local groups. Those member groups collect that input, and they bring those collectively to NSAC. As a coalition together, we work together to identify shared priorities, to develop great strategy, and to campaign together to win, to make change happen. To do that, we bring those asks both directly in DC and in partnership with our members on the ground. We bring those asks to Congress and to agencies like USDA. We do the nuts and bolts work of translating a problem on the ground into a policy solution, and we do the work to get it from idea to reality. So that's what we do, and the Farm Bill is kind of the biggest thing that we work on. So we're really excited about this time of the process. All right. And just a couple of terms to define before we jump right in, because this is the 101, and I want to get those started so you can kind of feel comfortable with what we're talking about. So let's work through those real quick. A little Policy 101 refresher. As a reminder, everything here in DC starts with elections. You can't get good policy without having good people who care about sustainable ag and food and farms into office. It's important to note this is a phase in the process that we do not work on. We don't do electoral campaigns, and we are officially and very fully nonpartisan, as we are a nonprofit. But it's important to know that those folks do have a say, and they do get to make decisions. The two pieces that we'll focus the most on today are authorization and appropriations. These unnecessarily long multi-syllable words are DC jargon for two key pieces of the process. Authorization, all that simply means is writing bills. Congress authorizes agencies in the federal government to do stuff, to create a rule, to create a new program, to change a policy. This is how a bill becomes a law, that classic schoolhouse rock process. That's authorization. The next thing that we'll talk about a little bit today is appropriations. This is quite simply funding things, ensuring funding goes where it's needed. Those are the two pieces we'll talk the most about today because that's the time of the process that we're in. I want to mention two other important ones just so you have those words familiar for you. Implementation. This is the work of saying all that good stuff that was in the Farm Bill, is it working properly on the ground, all the way down to the county level, to the individual level? Is it working as intended? There's a lot of work in implementation. We like to say here that getting a win in the Farm Bill is only 30%. 70% of the work is actually in getting it implemented properly. And then always, throughout everything, is evaluation. Are things working correctly? Can we improve them? So that's just a couple of terms that you'll hear us use, and I want to especially emphasize we'll talk the most today about authorization. So let's talk Farm Bill. When you hear people say the Farm Bill is being reauthorized, what they mean by that is Congress is preparing to write a new Farm Bill. Now, not every bill that comes through Congress needs to be, as they say, reauthorized. Some are permanent. Some can go on forever. The Farm Bill does have to be rewritten periodically. Could Congress just kind of pass a carbon copy of the old one with the dates changed? Sure. Could they scrap the whole thing, rebuild a barn like this beautiful structure, rewrite it completely? Yes. What will they actually do? Keep some of it the same, change some of it, add some, remove some. What's on tap for the next little bit in this talk? I'll give you a little historical context, a reminder of why we do this work, why it's important. We'll talk through what's in the bill and what's out. What does it mean to be in the bill? A little Farm Bill behind the numbers. A little bit about that civics process. How is this thing going to become law? And some scenarios and challenges ahead. So that's what we'll cover today. All right. Well, let's start with a little historical context just for background for everybody. Congress has been writing farm bills since 1933. The first farm bill was actually part of FDR's New Deal, written in the midst of we're trying to attempt recovery from the Great Depression. This photo that you see on the screen is actually a Dust Bowl era photo, so very early time in farm bill policy. Why did they write a farm bill? Why is the federal government involved in this stuff? It came about for two primary reasons that are related. First, rock bottom prices for farmers due to overproduction, leading to extreme economic distress for farmers, and secondarily, and also, extensive hunger and poverty, again, Great Depression, both on and off farms across America. The original farm bills sought to address these two really significant issues. Early farm bills also sought to tackle really catastrophic erosion and soil loss due to drought and land stewardship issues. See again this Dust Bowl photo. Lack of credit for small farmers, basic rural infrastructure needs, unfair export and trade policies, and a whole lot more. These historic outlines, this very original challenge, low prices for farmers and hunger in America, can still be seen in the outlines of two of the new farm bills today. When we go over the outline of today's bill, you're going to see some shades of all of these things still present. The SNAP, or food stamp program for hunger, commodity programs and crop insurance for farmers, incentives for farmers to use conservation practices, and a whole lot more. In essence, every time they rewrite this bill, they add a little more. They try to address new problems and move forward with different steps. So before we get into, yes, I have a great question. How often does the Farm Bill need to be reauthorized? It's a little bit variable, but it's roughly every 5 years, give or take. And we'll get into some specific dates in a little bit, but roughly every 5 years, which means we've had a lot of them. Why do we do this work? Why is it important? Can't we just trust decision makers to figure it out on their own? Definitely not. So before I get into some specifics, a little big picture stuff because this does matter. Like I said at the beginning, there's a lot of ways, a lot of important ways to improve our food and farm system. Everything from choosing to be a producer, choosing to be someone who grows good food for your community, to working to connect those in need with the food that they deserve, to starting a food hub, to working with farm to school and getting better food for kids. Like, those are all amazing ways to work on the food system. Policy undergirds them all, and policy is a really valuable tool. It's not the only tool. You can just do the great work on the ground, but policy is really valuable. And the Farm Bill is the biggest piece of policy that sets the rules of the road for our nation's food and farm system. It influences what's produced, how it's produced, by whom it is produced, what's done with those products, where they can be sold, and really importantly, who can afford and access them. It also influences the health of our environment and our local economies. And really importantly, why do we do this? The good stuff that's in the bill does not come out of nowhere. It's been created because people like you cared enough to ask for it and demand that the Farm Bill align with what you see as needs back home. I want to mention, too, that the Farm Bill has extraordinarily important equity considerations. Historically speaking, farmers of color, women farmers, and others have experienced discrimination and other serious barriers to access with regards to what we think of as really critical basic building blocks of building a farm business. Things like credit, crop insurance, access to land. With the barriers that they have faced, this has made it harder for them to compete in the marketplace, resulted in a lot in land loss and in significant challenges. Working on the policies in the Farm Bill is a way to work to address inequity and advance policies, more equitable policies that work for everyone. And we'll talk some more about that throughout. Many of the programs and many of the things that we think of today as kind of key ways the federal government supports sustainable ag or beginning farmers or local food, those were created by the sustainable ag community. A member of Congress generally doesn't independently come up with an amazing idea and just do it of their own goodwill. It is a political world here. They do it because people ask them to. Just want to give you a couple quick examples. Just to take one quick item as an example, cover crops. I would imagine that many of you are familiar with cover crops, the notion of planting a crop in your fields in between your cash crops that helps cover up that soil, reduce erosion, and improve the health of your soil. Think clover, think rye. This is a long time practice. It's indigenous. Farmers have been doing it for absolutely generations to improve their soil, to reduce weed and pest pressure, and diversify what they grow. One would think that policy ought to encourage cover crops and support something that has such a positive impact on the land. However, policy doesn't always keep up. Until quite recently, and under lots of advocacy pressure, cover crops conflicted very significantly with crop insurance, which is a federal product or a federally subsidized product, in a way that meant a farmer using cover crops, which we recognize as a good thing and in fact encourage farmers to do, could make them ineligible for crop insurance, which is really important for a lot of farmers. Why is that? Because policy takes time to catch up with what's important. And it's very important that real people like you, that farmers, that advocates, that communities have a chance to weigh in and say, hey, this isn't working. We need to fix this. We're working on that even now. Another example, policy changes through the Farm Bill have made it progressively more doable, better, easier for people who have SNAP benefits to shop at farmers markets. This is a policy thing. It's a policy solution to make it possible and to encourage and support that transaction so that those folks have just as much opportunity to shop at a farmer's market as anybody else. That's really important, and policy changes have helped to make that possible. Those are just two examples of how this very big bill has a very real, direct, specific connection back to real communities and real businesses. And so with that, I want to drop in to some nuts and bolts. Here's the policy text right here. What is the Farm Bill? Comprehensive multi-year piece of legislation reauthorized about every 5 years. And again, like I mentioned earlier, those two words, authorization and appropriations. Remember, if you recall, those are bills, writing a bill, aka, writing some new rules, creating new programs, and appropriations, funding them. Just like there are those two steps in the policy process, there are different kinds of bills that Congress can pass. They can pass authorizing legislation, meaning it creates or establishes policies and programs, and they can pass appropriations legislation. That's where the money is. A Farm Bill is an authorizing piece of legislation. That means it contains policies, programs, and sometimes funding. We'll talk a little bit more about what it means to be in the Farm Bill in a little bit more detail in just a second. First, I want to just do a quick walkthrough of what's in the bill from a title perspective, and again, then we'll talk a little bit more about what does it mean to be in the bill. The Farm Bill is organized into titles. Again, that's a jargon word. You can think of it simply as a chapter of a book. It makes it easier. It's organized this way primarily so staff here in D.C., people who work for members of Congress, can figure out where things go and can keep a little organizing to it. Part of being kind of conversant in the language of the Farm Bill is understanding its titles and where the issues that you care about may live. Some things can be found entirely in one title. Others might span several. But don't feel here that you need to memorize the 12 titles, or that if you can't speak exactly to the title that you won't be effective. That's definitely not the case. This is just a helpful context to understand how the Farm Bill might be, how it's organized internally. So a little bit more about what's in and what's out before we excuse me. Actually, I forgot one important point, so let me go back for a second. So what does a title contain? This is a good thing to include. It includes authorization for programs, aka Congress is okay to run a program, language guiding how a program must be run, and potentially funding. All right, we'll talk more about that too. Here's another good thing to know, and this is also really important in developing kind of familiarity with the Farm Bill. And again, don't feel like you need to be an expert in this. Learning what's in and out of the Farm Bill is kind of life's work. It's a lot. It's always fair to ask, always great to talk to Google or talk to folks at NSAC or Southern SAWG if you have questions about this. But for a quick overview, while I have said the Farm Bill is really comprehensive. It's the rules of the road for food and ag. There are some things that are in and some things that are not. In, you can see commodity programs, crop insurance, conservation, credit, forestry, anti-hunger and nutrition assistance, rural development, research, trade. What's out? These things are definitely food and farm issues, but guess what? Not in the Farm Bill. That includes the lion's share of farm and food worker rights and protection, public land grazing issues, irrigation water rights, particularly an issue out west, FDA issues and food safety, renewable fuels, taxes, school meals, WIC, and GMO labeling. These are all issues that are not covered by Congress under the Farm Bill. So that means that there are other vehicles in Congress that one would look to influence those issues. So let's talk about what it means to be in the Farm Bill. This is where we get down to some specifics. So again, it's the authorization. This is Congress's permission to USDA. Hey, USDA, we authorize you to create this program. By the way, we're going to give you some money to get it started. We're going to decide on definitions. What do these key words mean? What do we mean by beginning farmer, for example? We'll decide eligibility. Let's say who's eligible for crop insurance, who might be eligible for food stamps, for SNAP. Priorities. Maybe we should prioritize certain types of farmers or certain communities to receive support, and a whole lot more. Congress really can set the broad outlines of all of that within the Farm Bill for any program or policy. Let me just give you, here's a good example if we're thinking again about equity. Congress can choose when it's writing the Farm Bill to include a special priority, maybe even funding especially set aside to serve a particular group of folks who may have experienced barriers or had limited access to support in the past. For example, many of the conservation programs that help farmers implement really good practices that are good for their soil and water, thinking about cover crops, low flow irrigation, things that help them use less water and help their soil. There are set-asides within those programs that are especially targeted to farmers of color. This is intended to help, again, redress past wrongs and make sure that those folks have access to support. Another example of kind of what it means to be in the Farm Bill that will lead us into a little conversation about funding. The Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program. Some of you may have applied for this program if you run a nonprofit, or if you're a beginning farmer, you may have participated in a beginning farmer training that was funded by this program. Congress authorized it, created it several farm bills back, and I believe the 2002 Farm Bill, but they didn't give it any money. So it didn't actually receive funding to get started until 2008. So it's not always a guarantee that to be in the Farm Bill means that it's magically created and good to go. So let's talk a little bit just for a minute about funding. As part of that authorization, usually there's a funding component. Either Congress can say, sweet, we love this, we're giving you mandatory funding. It must be funded every year. Or they can say, we're going to give you what we call discretionary funding. That means we're going to bump it over to our friends, the appropriators, and they can decide how much funding to allocate. And I don't want to get heavy in the jargon here, but it's useful to know these two because programs and the issues that you care about may have one or two, may have one kind of funding, both kinds, or both kinds, or just one. Mandatory is exactly what it sounds like. Farm Bill says, we mandate a certain amount of money is provided to this program. BFRDP, the Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program, has mandatory funding. in the current Farm Bill. That means every year, automatically, over the life of the Farm Bill, that program receives its funding. Now, discretionary funding is the other type of funding. Here in DC, we say it's not quite as helpful as that mandatory funding. Why is that? Because it's not automatic. Rather than saying every year, here we come, the funding's going to show up, rather they say, well, this program is authorized to have funding, but we're going to let the appropriators decide how much. We'll talk more about those appropriators in a little bit, but what that means is every darn year, every single year, the appropriators are going to debate about how much money to give that program. Here's an example of what that looks like. The Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, the SARE program. Now, if we were in an auditorium, I'd love to see hands up for who's maybe heard of SARE or worked with SARE. It's been around for 30 years. It's one of our very first programs that we helped create 30 years ago. We got it authorized in response to members saying, hey, there needs to be more research on sustainable ag practices, and hey, guess what? Farmers can do that too. Farmers would like to do on-farm research to help advance it. SARE exists to do that. It provides funding to researchers, to grad students, and really importantly, to farmers to conduct the research on their farms. And then really valuably and awesomely, it helps disseminate those results back out to the farming community. Now, we got it authorized in the 80s, but it was only given discretionary funding. So that means every year when appropriators get started on the year's funding, we have to tell them, please, please fund SARE. We're trying to, and we have to work every year to protect its funding. SARE is authorized for up to $60 million a year. To date, we've only received discretionary funding of up to, I believe, 24.7 or 20. We're in the high 20s now for funding for SARE. So we could have 60, but appropriators have only given it in the 20s in terms of money. So that's a big difference. It's a lot harder. So that's a little bit about what it means to be in. Talk briefly about kind of some 2014 Farm Bill highlights and lowlights and what's in it again. What happened in 2014? Congress did a major redesign of commodity programs. They heard from many folks, hey, things are not working well. We need it to be improved. They significantly expanded crop insurance coverage. They also expanded subsidies. They consolidated and cut conservation programs. They also cut some other really important programs, including SNAP and including a program, Section 2501, or Outreach and Assistance for Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers and Veterans. On the good side, they added new diversified farm insurance for farmers who maybe don't grow just one or two row crops, but maybe you have some animals and some livestock, or animals and some row crops. There's an insurance product now for that, thanks to farmers and advocates saying, we need this. They expanded support for farmers markets, organic and local food. They expanded support for beginning farmers and ranchers. So a lot that we did not love, but certainly some good stuff too. We'll talk a little bit about, okay, how did that pie get sliced? What does that mean? Okay, you said, okay, here's the big picture. When it was signed, the Farm Bill's total cost in mandatory funding, that's automatic funding, was nearly $489 billion. 80% of that went to the nutrition title, of which the lion's share is the SNAP, or food stamp program. Another 8% went to crop insurance, 6% to conservation, 5% to what we think of as commodities, and 1% for quite literally everything else. Research, extension, local food, organics, specialty crops, rural development, forestry, trade. Everything else falls into 1%. Now, these are approximate percents. The actual numbers have changed a little bit over the last few years, as those numbers were projections. What happens in the real world does impact the total cost of the Farm Bill. For example, as the economy has improved since 2014, SNAP spending has gone down. But as commodity prices for farmers have gone down, those subsidy costs to support farmers have gone up. Let's talk about the 1%. No, not that 1%, this 1%. Everything else that is not one of those big pieces I just walked through falls into that 1%. So it's helpful when we think about the overall investment that we're making in food and ag. We are not putting, relatively speaking, a ton of money into this, and we could absolutely be doing more. How does a farm bill get passed? Well, that was supposed to be an animation of some really cute dogs on a train. It appears that ReadyTalk is not going to let me do that. So, darn, sorry guys, you're going to have to miss out on the awesome dogs. I can still talk to you about how a farm bill gets passed, though. So you might be wondering, okay, that's a really big bill. That's an extraordinary amount of money. How does this thing get packaged up and get passed? Like, how do they come to agreement on such a thing? The way we like to think about it here is think about the farm bill as a long freight train. This would be a lot better if we had our cute dogs going in a circle. Think about it as a freight train with two powerful engines up front that are pulling along the whole process. The first engine is what we call farm commodity programs that support the production of staple commodities. These are things like corn, soybeans, feed grains for animals, wheat, rice, peanuts, beans, sugar, cotton, and dairy, just for example. For the most recent two farm bills, that engine also includes federal crop insurance policy. So if we think about that as the first engine, commodity programs for those staple big crops and crop insurance. The second engine is nutrition programs. Growing importance over the last 5 decades, especially during times of economic downturn, is federal nutrition programs, making sure that those in need have food access. Really, really important. The interplay between those two engines has been central to the passage of a farm bill. You can think about them as the two engines that pull everything else along as the freight cars are the train. Conservation, credit, rural development, local food, research, organics, those all have to hitch a ride to those very big two engines. The process of fixing up those engines, getting them to go, and determining what's going to be in the freight cars is the process of developing the farm bill. The freight cars are going to go absolutely nowhere without those two engines pulling the process along. One other thing I'll mention here before we talk a little bit about how a bill becomes a law is, historically speaking, we've needed both engines pulling to get the bill out of the station and into law. People have tried in Congress separating them and passing them separately, so passing a kind of a farm side and a food side of the bill. But the last time they tried in 2012 and 2013, it was a disaster. If one of those engines derails in Congress, it's going to be a lot harder for all of us to get a bill done. So let's talk a little bit about, if I can get my slide to advance. We'll wait a moment for that slide to advance, and then hopefully folks can see that next slide. It looks like it's taken a moment to load. I don't know. If someone doesn't mind chatting me, can you guys see now the how does a bill become a law slide, moving on from the dogs and trains? It is not moved on my screen, and I want to make sure you can see it. Everybody says still seeing the dogs. Okay, thank you. I appreciate that note. Appreciate it. We will try. Let's see here if I can figure out a trick. Thank you, folks, for that. I appreciate it. Oops. Let's see here. Apologies in advance. Apologies for that. Oh, there we go. Okay, we got it. Just a little hung up here. Thanks for your patience, folks. Appreciate it. You should now see how a bill becomes a law. Anybody who's watched Schoolhouse Rock recently will recognize this process. And I won't spend a long time on it because I don't want to, I know that many of you are going to be familiar with this already, but I want to make sure it's a review, and it's good for all of us to know these basics. The standard process that we all learn in high school or college, this is how a bill gets written. The Committee of Jurisdiction, aka the folks in charge of that issue area, they get together and they take a first cut. They write a bill. Every member of that committee has a chance to weigh in, to make a request, to try and influence its text. And each of those committees has a staff that does that hard work under the leadership of the chair to pull the package together. Once they've got a first draft they feel good about, they go through what's called markup. Markup is basically, if you think about people sitting around with a bunch of text and a red pen, it's sort of the big picture version of that. They sit down together and they debate it, and they introduce amendments sometimes to make changes. That happens in committee. Once they finish that process, they take a vote. If the committee approves it, it is known as reported out of committee and ready for the floor. Here's where a lot of things get hung up because there's not a lot of floor time in Congress. It's a busy, they surprisingly, for how few laws get signed in the White House, they stay busy here. Floor time is in demand. So that's the first step. First, each one of those committees must completely separately write its own bill and report it out. Then it's ready for the floor. That bill must also be heard by the full floor in each chamber. So the House Ag Committee bill goes to the House chamber, and the Senate Committee bill goes to the Senate chamber. The full body has a chance to introduce amendments, to debate, and to vote up or down on whether they support the bill. At that point, what you hopefully have are two bills. They're likely quite different because the two chambers are quite different. Then they have to figure out how to put them together, how to combine them into one. This is called conference. It's usually composed of House and Senate leadership plus leadership from those key agriculture committees. That is often done in private and secret, behind closed doors with little transparency. But in theory, they're going to come out with something they feel okay about. And yes, it has to go once more to the floor of the House and the Senate, be passed, and then, if that happens, that final bill, approved by everybody, goes to the White House for the president's signature. That's the classic process. That's what we hope happens in sort of textbook fashion. And you can see to the right there kind of our best case scenario for timing. Estimated that markup in committees would begin in early spring 2018, which could put things on the floor next spring and summer. Could mean that conference happens in the summer, which means they get a bill back to the floor for final approval late summer, early fall of 2018, and ideally get a new bill signed into law before, now here's a key date, September 30th of 2018. September 30th, 2018 is the day that the bill we have now, the bill that's underpinning our entire food and farm system, expires. What if they don't do that? We'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. One other thing I'll mention here, and this is kind of previewing a little bit our advocacy talk in a few weeks. You might be thinking, well, geez, how do they reconcile the differences in the bills, and what does that mean for advocacy? Do I have to win in both bills? So here's something. Think about each of these steps on each side of the Congress, so the House and the Senate, as an opportunity to win, an opportunity to get something really important included in the bill. That could look like maybe on the Senate side, we get a really important funding for conservation in the Senate bill, and on the House side, they're really supportive of organic crop insurance. A win in either side, we can try to keep in that bill and make sure that it makes it through conference into the final bill. So each one of these steps, think about it this way. It's an opportunity to win and an opportunity to get the things that our community wants to see changed and improved in the bill. And it can be a long process, and it's the other reason I include this here is it's good to think about it as a long process. The Farm Bill is not a one and done. I called once and I helped, and it was it. We'll talk again more about advocacy in a few weeks, but big picture, it takes a while, and because members of Congress are busy and they have a lot going on, multiple contacts and engaging with them over the long haul is really, really helpful. All right. Let's see. And now I want to talk a little bit about some key players and help you get a sense of where the power is in D.C. and out in where you live around the Farm Bill. But first I want to explain something that's missing from that chart. You probably saw that in a bill becomes a law chart. There was nothing about appropriations. They didn't say anything about appropriators. You're probably saying, why are you talking about appropriators? I thought the Farm Bill was written by the Ag committees. It is. But I want to mention two other kind of folks, two other committees here in D.C. who are important and are good to kind of keep in the back of your mind as folks who are really influential here in D.C. as well. Again, the Farm Bill, it's that word again, authorizing piece of legislation, establishing policies, creating programs. However, in the case of some programs, when they say, oh, we're going to give you discretionary funding, they will bump that issue over to appropriators. Under normal order, which hasn't happened for quite a while, every single spring, the appropriators will, with help from the budget committees who give them kind of a big picture spending level, they will make decisions about how to disperse federal funding across a wide array of programs, including ag programs. I mention it here because while we're working now to get ready for the rewriting of a new Farm Bill, hopefully to be passed in 2018, we're still living under the 2014 Farm Bill, and we're still making decisions this year and next year around key programs and around stuff that's really important for farmers and for eaters concurrently. So the whole thing doesn't stop just because we're rewriting one bill. That means we'll be working continually on the bill we're living with now and getting ready for the new one. So I just mentioned that there to help you know that there's, alas, a lot of quite a few flaming torches to juggle, or flaming. What are those? Anyway, we'll go with I forget the name of those little juggler things. Anyway, juggling balls. There will be yet another ball to juggle in terms of the important work going forward. And let me get the next slide. So, who are the key players in the process? Who matters? Top and most important folks are congressional committees. The House Committee on Agriculture and the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. And don't forget those appropriators. Also important, everybody in Congress will get their hands on the Farm Bill and have a chance to weigh in. The President, though historically speaking in the last several Farm Bills, White Houses have not taken a major stand on agriculture. As our country has become less agriculturally driven, as the ag is sort of farmers are a shrinking portion of our populace, the White House has taken a little bit less of an aggressive push on the Farm Bill, but they do have to sign the bill. Really importantly, advocacy groups, folks like NSAC, Southern SAWG. On the other side, there are industry lobbyists. There are big, big, big players in this world who really want to influence that bill. And most importantly, you. Again, we will talk more about what you can do over the course of this series. But what I'll emphasize here, just in the short version, is if you care about farmers and the food that you eat, it's 100% worth your time to get involved and get informed. So thank you for that. Thank you for being here today and for being part of this conversation. Let's name some names. Here we go. Key legislators in the Southern SAWG region. I apologize, this is a lot of names. It's a little hard to read. We can also send these slides out via PDF for anybody who would like them easier to read at their leisure. If you see the state that you live in the Southern SAWG region listed here, that means that one of your members of Congress sits on either the House or Senate Ag Committee. If you see a $ after their name, that means they're an agriculture appropriator. That means they help make decisions about funding. As you can see, the South is very, very, very well represented when it comes, to agriculture decision making. All across the South, members of Congress, Democratic and Republican, are sitting on these committees and going to be making very important decisions going forward. If you see someone you recognize on this list, if this is one of your members, that means, lucky you, you have extra opportunities to have a voice because you're going to have a chance to communicate with somebody who gets to really get their hands in and help to write the bill. If you don't see your members of Congress on here, that does not mean they can't be helpful or that they won't have a role to play. And again, we'll talk more about that when we talk advocacy. Long story short, these people can do the most, but absolutely every member of Congress can be helpful. Let's go to the next slide. I want to show you, I know I'm a map person, so in case you'd like a little visual representation, what this map represents right here are states across the southern region with senators on either the Senate Agriculture Committee, that's the Farm Bill Committee, or the Agriculture Appropriations Subcommittee. Those are the folks who make those discretionary funding decisions. As you can see, 5 states across the SAWG region have a senator who sits on a committee. Here's what that map looks like for the House. Let me just note a disclaimer, if there's anybody on the line from North Carolina, Florida, or Virginia, this map, they hadn't yet released a handy-dandy map with redistricting from 2016, so these district lines are not quite perfect. So just so you know, this map is a little, the districts are correct, but the lines are a little outdated. But as you can see, the House is very, very well represented across. And actually, it's missing Oklahoma, so in your mind, please do fill in Oklahoma because Frank Lucas is still on committee. It's like we're missing one. But in any case, you can see Democrats and Republicans across the region have a big say in writing the next bill. All right. Now we're going to get into some super fun stuff, and we're also getting pretty close to the end in time for Q&A because I know you guys probably have questions. I want to talk a little bit about detours, ditches, and roundabouts. So now we just went through and talked about what's in that Farm Bill, roughly speaking, how will it get passed, and who are the kind of key folks who are going to write it. I want to talk about a couple possible kind of caution signs in the road or risks moving forward, things that could make life a little more complicated for us. And we won't spend a deep amount of time on it because it gets a little bit weedy. But I think it's useful for you, again, just to get that sense of, you're going to read about this in the news, great to give you kind of that insider take on what it really means. The first thing I want to mention is what's called budget reconciliation. You might have read about this in the news in the context of the healthcare debate and some of congressional leadership's goals around tax reform or making changes to tax codes this year. That is a tool, they use a tool called budget reconciliation for that. In effect, what it is saying, hey, as part of our overall budget spending numbers for this year, not only are we going to make decisions about that discretionary funding, we're also going to send directions over to authorizing committees like the Ag Committee and ask them to open up their bills and cut the mandatory spending that they oversee to pay for other priorities. It's spending provisions only, so they can't go in and make tons of policy changes with it. But they are if a budget resolution passes, and if it has those reconciliation instructions in it, the committees have to do it. They have to find that money, and they have to report it back to the Budget Committee. Importantly, budget reconciliation bills are filibuster-proof in the Senate. They can be passed with a simple majority and not a 60-vote filibuster-proof majority. We won't get deep into the weeds on this, but I bring it up because the House Budget Committee did release their budget resolution shortly before recess, and it does include reconciliation instructions for the House Ag Committee of they ask them to make cuts of $10 billion from the Farm Bill. Now, there's a long road to go before this becomes reality. That resolution would have to be passed in the House, and for the Senate to take action, they would have to pass, something would have to pass in the Senate too. But this means the wheels are in motion, and we need to watch it very closely. Why do we need to watch this closely? Reconciliation took place around the Farm Bill in 1996 and 2005. And in 1996, as part of it, the bill made very deep cuts to SNAP, and there is fear that could happen again. When you look at that total cost of the Farm Bill, hundreds of billions of dollars, $10 billion can sound like a small amount relatively speaking, but what it would result in are real changes and impacts to people in need, and also it would be politically very, very contentious, and the concern is that that contentiousness could imperil the overall chances of getting a Farm Bill done. So that's the short term. That's the short version. Mandatory cuts outside of a normal process without the same level of transparency, and concerns for how that would impact getting a final bill done. Why do we want to get a Farm Bill done on time? We'll talk about that in a minute. I want to mention two more things. So budget reconciliation is the ditch. That is the risk of sending our Farm Bill train off the tracks into the ditch. A detour, or apologies, no, that's a detour. I got my metaphors confused. Reconciliation is a detour. It's a spin down an alternate path that could have big implications for the Farm Bill. The ditch, the Farm Bill train off the tracks into the ditch, is if folks in Congress attempt to split up those two engines, the farm pieces and the food hunger pieces. They have attempted to do this in the past, and it has not gone well. However, it is political. Folks are often tempted to do so because they feel that they can make more changes and get it done that way. Did not work in 2012 and 13. A bill actually failed on the floor, which is very, very unusual as part of this big, sort of the kickoff of that. Long story short, if you ever want the long history of that, I can recommend some great blog posts for you. Long story short, to get a Farm Bill done, last time, Congress, after much heat and debate, put those bills back together and passed the combined package. Historically speaking, that is the only way a Farm Bill gets passed. So if they split the bills, that is a concern that the train could be off the tracks and into the ditch. So we've got the detour, we've got the ditch. What's the roundabout? The roundabout would be if Congress does not succeed in passing a new bill on time and they end up simply extending the old one. This is something that we do often here in DC. It's called a continuing resolution. They can continue the old one into the future. This buys them more time to keep debating, to figure out solutions, to sort of pass the buck. And it's kind of like going in circles. So we call it a roundabout. This did happen during the last Farm Bill, and it can create some unexpected or some really big issues for those of us in sustainable food and farm issues. I'll talk about that soon. So a couple other big picture things, and then we'll kind of wrap it up. So this little bullet point list right here is just a couple of kind of big picture question marks or things to keep an eye on in the news that may have an impact on whether or not we can get a Farm Bill done, how good that Farm Bill will be for farmers and for eaters, or whether we're going to get stuck with a detour or a ditch or a roundabout. First is SNAP. As folks have probably gathered in the news, it's going to be a big topic and one of great debate in the next Farm Bill. There may be attempts to make cuts to SNAP, particularly under budget reconciliation. Those imperil the Farm Bill. Cotton and dairy producers are struggling with low prices and safety net programs from the current Farm Bill that aren't working too well for them. They really want fixes. Those are going to cost money. Where will that money come from is a big question yet. The overall farm economy is not great right now. Prices are low, export markets have tightened, and folks are really feeling the pinch. As many of you likely know, this has an impact on how the Farm Bill gets done. Conservation programs. When prices go down, sometimes farmers get more interested in conservation, particularly maybe setting some land aside into conservation for a while. In a way, that's a good thing, but it also, again, costs money, and we have to think about where does that money come from and making sure we're not making cuts. Last two things to talk about real quick. We'll talk about for a minute about stranded programs, and we're going to talk for a minute about marker bills. So let me go to the next slide. So here's the deal. Why do we want a farm bill to get done? Why is it bad to just get on the roundabout, around and around with the old one? Here's one of the big reasons. One, we miss out on an opportunity to advance equity and make positive changes to improve things. The other thing that we miss is that many programs in the Farm Bill that are really valuable to farmers and communities, their authorization runs out. When the old bill ends, they will run out of money, and they will not automatically get more money unless Congress specifically provides for them in an extension. That costs money. That can be hard to do. During the last Farm Bill debate, a whole host of programs just went and lost their money for a year. It had real impacts on farmers and on nonprofits and communities. We would really like to avoid that again. Second piece, last one thing. I want you to also be familiar with a really important term that you're going to likely hear quite a bit going forward, and that's called marker bills. We think of these as a key tool in the kind of marketplace of ideas around the Farm Bill. Marker bills are packages of improvements, programs, changes, reforms that we want to see in the next Farm Bill, packaged together in a way that makes it easier for people like you to say, hey, I support that effort, and for members of Congress to endorse that effort. So you are likely to see news and opportunities to take action in the coming months around this list of options that you see in front of you, and likely many more. Again, they're not individual bills, but they are rather things that we think should be placed into those freight cars, into the Farm Bill, to be moved forward. We'll go a deep dive on those issue areas and what's in them and what those look like in our next webinar. And my last big thing here that I want to mention before we take questions, and I'll say if you have questions, please feel free to go ahead and type them into the question box, and then I can make sure we go through them, are a couple key deadlines to keep in the back of your mind. The first, I mentioned this a few times, we are living under the 2014 Farm Bill. It expires on September 30th, 2018. By this point, by that date, Congress needs to either pass a new Farm Bill needs to be signed into law, or they need to extend the old one. Next big date, this is actually coming up in just a few weeks. September 5th, 2017, Congress returns from their long August recess, may start work early on writing the 2018 Farm Bill. I know I said most of that work will happen in 2018. We think that's the case. Many of them are kind of antsy to get the ball rolling, and we might see some initial movement forward in those committees as early as this fall. So we don't have a lot of time. Now is a good time to start thinking about it and get going. And then finally, I include congressional recess periods when both the House and Senate will be back home. They go back home periodically. Keep an eye out. Are they doing a town hall? Are they holding coffee chats or office hours? It's a great time to go and introduce yourself, talk about who you are, what you do, and encourage them to support a Farm Bill that works for you. So we'll talk again more about advocacy during our next webinar, but there's some dates for you to keep in mind. They're going to be home around Thanksgiving, and they're going to be home around Christmas. And then finally, again, as we said a few times, winter and spring of 2018 is when we anticipate the most activity and the best window to influence the Farm Bill, but now is an absolutely fine time to start. As a reminder, here's what's coming up next. Please do register and join us for the next few webinars, and here's a little detail on what you'll be able to find in those and what we'll cover. The program drill down that I mentioned, advocacy for busy people. We really do design that for whether you just have a few moments and you just want to know what's the best thing I can do, to maybe you want to be a local leader. And then very importantly, we want to listen to and hear from you. All right, and then my last slide before we take questions is just let's keep this conversation going. You can find our websites here, sign up for emails, and I'll put in a plug for the monthly Southern SAWG PA policy calls. If you like this stuff, if you want to learn more and talk more, just email policy@southernsawg.org, at SSAWG.org, and they can add you to the list. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions that folks may have. And just a reminder that if you have questions, please do type them into the chat box, and we'll take them as they come. And I hear folks asking about slides. Yes, we will gladly send out the slides to folks in a PDF form right after this webinar. We're going to take a little time to get the video file processed, but yes, we will gladly share the slides with folks. And please feel free to use them and share them and help make use of them in however you would like. Okay, yeah, great question. Any chance for new conservation incentive programs dealing with climate adaptation in this farm bill? That's a great question, Zach. Appreciate it. So the answer is yes and no. Under this farm bill, we are unlikely to see big conservation initiatives branded around climate change or really focusing heavily or very explicitly on climate change, but the folks working on conservation programs for farmers are working really hard to make sure that conservation practices that are climate friendly are as high priority as they can be in the programs, if that makes sense. So trying to make sure that a farmer choosing practices that are good for the soil and climate friendly, we want to make sure those are as high priority and as high ranking as they can be for farmers. So that's kind of one of the ways that it's going to be addressed in this next bill. And there's a lot of folks working on that. So if you have follow-up questions or you want to talk to someone about it, I'm happy to connect you. Will the replay be sent automatically? Unfortunately, it's not automatic, but it doesn't take us too long to get it processed, so we'll do it as fast as we can. And has there been any talk of a technology title to help farmers and ranchers access new technologies? That is really interesting. I have not heard about that, but I would be happy to ask around here if folks know. And I do know that it's a topic of interest. The notion of accessing technology is one that's of interest to folks on the Ag Committee, both in terms of tech for farmers and then also in issues around, while not directly Farm Bill related, rural infrastructure does overlap some with rural broadband and the importance of internet access, including for farmers. So I'd be happy to also ask around here. I haven't heard anything personally, but definitely worth keeping an eye on. And if you have specific ideas for what such a title might include, by all means, please feel free to follow up. My email address is in the little organizer reminder that you got for this webinar, and I'm happy to follow up on that. And then the last question, do we have a list of marker bills that we're following now? We do. They are coming in fast and furious. We call it the marketplace of ideas because it really is quite a jumble, and there's all kinds of stuff going out there. Yes, we do follow them. There's quite a few here at NSAC. We hope for several of ours that we've been championing to be introduced next month in September. And in addition to that, there have been good ones and bad ones introduced over the last few months. If you are interested in looking for agriculture-related bills, one, I'd be happy to share some of the key ones we've been following if you follow up with me. Likewise, if you have not yet checked out govtrack.us, govtrack.us, that is a website where you can track bills introduced in Congress and sort them by issue area. So you could do a search within GovTrack for agriculture-related bills and get a pretty good beat on it yourself. Last question. Yes, thank you. Thank you for those who have put in their contact info, and I will look forward to following up with you. And then I have another question, a question about nutrition guidelines. So if you're thinking about school food nutrition guidelines, those are actually in a different bill under the jurisdiction of a different committee. And I'm pretty sure as well that the FDA nutrition labels are under a different bill. I'd have to double check, but I'm pretty sure that both of those are under the auspices of another committee. So would not be a Farm Bill issue. Great, and I think we got through all of the questions. If anybody else has additional ones, or if you think of something later, please don't hesitate to be in touch. Glad to answer further questions, glad to connect you to resources or materials. And finally, just one last encouragement. If you enjoy this content, please join us for the rest of our series. If you miss one, we will record them. And we also meet monthly on the PCAN calls. Hop on that list if you haven't already. Join us. We'd love to have you, and we'd love to keep the work going forward. And with that, I will we'll sign off. We'll stop the recording. And, oh, right, Steve says quarterly on the PCAN calls. Right on. Calls are quarterly. Thank you all, and we look forward to following up.